You are listening to Radio Alamundi.
Hi there, wherever you are. I'm Marco Rixecker, a freelance writer, reporter, producer, teacher, translator, tour guide, poet, singer, and songwriter. I speak several languages, and I'm the creator and founder of Radio Alamundi, an evolving podcast station where no language and all languages are spoken. It's a multilingual mix of music, poetry, lectures, languages, interviews, documentaries, recipes, and a lot more, co-produced with the students of the Alamundi International Cultural Center. You can find us on radioalamundi.bandcamp.com, podcasts.apple.com, Spotify, YouTube, Breaker, Player FM, Facebook, search Radio Alamundi. The following narrative includes excerpts from a collection of testimonies and interviews entitled Let's Talk About It Anywhere in the World, where it is all about people's voices, accents, and speech patterns, hand in hand with my own personal anecdotes and observations. In addition to that, people are free to introduce themselves and speak their minds openly in their respective, often indigenous languages and dialects without any paraphrases or expectations. So, let the story go on from there. I love to listen to talk shows that allow me to catch up and stay in touch with all things Chicago. One of them regularly features local music from the Windy City. All sorts of styles can be heard, and that obviously includes jazz. That's how a trio named after its headman and founder gets my attention. Listening to bits and pieces of the Joe Policastro Trio's cool compositions is a pleasant experience to wake up to and have coffee with in the morning. So I end up bookmarking their website and, a while later, ask for an interview with Joe Policastro himself. Everything else develops pretty fast after that. Joe Policastro and I are in touch quickly and set up a date and time for an online interview from different places in the world. To be fairly honest, I'm a little surprised by the early hour, 8 a.m. in Chicago, for us to connect. It is not necessarily a time of the day you would associate with jazz. But Joe Policastro has kids, and they have to go to school before he moves on to what he calls his morning practice. What are we doing here so early in the morning?
That's a good reason. Well, I'll answer that one for you. So, first of all, I have two kids, and that changes your life drastically. And I still keep up a very, very, very intense kind of practice schedule and things. And I also just there's some things for myself that I like to do. I mean, I really sort of believe in fitness of mind, body, spirit kind of stuff. So I spend a good amount of time, probably 60 to 90 minutes doing exercising that really keeps my head clear and keeps me centered. I like to make sure that I'm sitting at a piano right now. It's fine. I like to practice. I'm not a good pianist by any stretch of the imagination, but I mean, I keep up regular practice on that. And my bass routine, because I do try to keep up on my classical stuff on top of my jazz, is pretty intense. I mean, it takes just to keep everything up and stay sharp and really, hopefully, keep growing. It's a lot of practice. And I can only find that I can get the time in to do it if I get up quite early.
But first things first. And so I asked Joe Policastro to introduce not only himself, but also the other members of his band who were not with us that day, as well as his musical projects and practices.
All right, my name is Joe Policastro, and I'm speaking to you from Chicago, Illinois, which is where I'm based. It is Monday, October the 10th at 8 a.m., and I have the pleasure to be doing this and connecting with Radio Alla Mundi. I'm a double bassist here in the Chicago area. I'm predominantly a jazz player, although I do quite a bit of classical stuff as well. And over the past few years, I've been focusing very heavily on a trio of my own. I've been very fortunate here in Chicago that I would be able to have a very functioning and happy career as a sideman, just, taking calls from people, playing different gigs, playing in other people's groups. And that's very satisfying as well. But about 11 or 12 years ago, I got a 3-night-a-week gig at a place called Pops for Champagne. And it wasn't my gig at the beginning. It was just a very simple background music gig that started as a duo. And over time, it evolved into a trio gig. And then eventually it fell into my lap. And at that point, I'd already been doing quite a bit of writing for that band. I also do a lot of arranging for small and large ensembles, so big bands or, nonettes, or even smaller things like quintets or sextets. And it was really fun to write for the trio, and I started putting a lot of original music into it. But our main focus was adapting music outside of the jazz realm into that context. And that band, around 2014, really sort of started to solidify into a very serious group. And at that point, we started putting out recordings regularly. And we started traveling quite a bit around 2016. What started as like small little trips, 2-3 day things turned into week-long trips, which turned into multi-week trips. So the band's comprised of a guitarist by the name of Dave Miller, who's also based in Chicago. And then the drummer is a guy named Mikel Avery, right, who currently is living in Philadelphia. Mikel was based here in Chicago for many, many years, and then he moved to New Orleans and then is now living in Philadelphia. So Mikel does the vast majority of the stuff that we do, especially on the road or the festivals and things. But I do, occasionally have some things here in Chicago that he can't cover. And we have another drummer named Andrew Green who kind of steps in, who really has learned the book and a wonderful drummer. But the band, as its core group, like I said, is Dave Miller on guitar and Mikel Avery on drums.
What have been some of your most creative accomplishments lately?
I think on just a personal level, this is just a small little side. I've made a real commitment to getting like very, very deeply back into the classical double bass side of things. And I would say over the past year, I mean, when I was young, I was, studying classical music in addition to jazz, and then just life and things took over, and not that I didn't keep that up. But it was just hard to keep up that kind of routine because you're just playing all the time, and you're trying to write music and lead bands, and you have kids, whatever it is, there's only so many hours in the day. And I just I started with a real commitment that I was like, you know what, I want that aspect of my playing to be strong again. And I've really made some big strides on just bringing so much of my solo classical bass repertoire back, and then just strengthening my orchestral playing too. So that's been just something that I've been enjoying for myself and my personal side of things. And then honestly, just being able to even restart this group. I mean, there was a point like in the pandemic, we had recorded a new album in January of 2020 and then went on the road for 2 weeks. And when we were coming back, things were starting to get weird. And we had all these plans set up for that summer, festivals, and all these things. And everything fell apart, as we all know, in March. And there was just a point where things just kept dragging on, and clubs were opening and closing, and it wasn't going to seem viable to take it out. I just remember getting out of the routine of all that. And I was like, do I even want to do this again? And then that record was supposed to come out on this like audiophile label, and it got shelved. So then I was like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and put this thing out. And I wanted to put it out on vinyl, and there was this huge vinyl backup. And that record is not going to be out until the end of 2023. But I had some material on there that I hadn't used. And I had some leftover material from our other albums. The band's had previously put out 4 albums. And I just was looking at some of this unused material next to this newest material. And some of the unused material goes all the way back to 2012. And I just put it together just to see what it sounded like. And I'm getting to my point about it'll bring up the new album and what is something I feel very proud of. I couldn't believe the through line of things a decade apart. These things sit together naturally on an album as if they were all recorded in one session. And I think that the commitment to a sound and a vision and approach for a band, and getting back to all those things, a band sound, a group sound, that kind of a commitment to it, it really comes through. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to put this out because I can get this out at least on CD and streaming and stuff for this year. I decided to book the band out and go back to some of our favorite stops. And so we're going out for a 3-week tour. So getting all of that, just restarting that felt very fresh. And I was just happy to be able to do it.
One of the first things our conversation focuses on is Joe Policastro's music and its relationship with his hometown, Chicago. Which part of you is Chicago?
That's a really interesting question. Because I think that there is definitely something that people refer to as a Chicago sound. But more than that, I almost think it's kind of an aesthetic. And from that aspect, I think what I mean by that is like there's like a band focus, something that's groups that are more interested in the sound of things as opposed to technique or frontman based kind of things. Like, when I say this is in no means a criticism. When you think of a lot of like New York bands, especially when you're talking about like jazz and things like that, you're often dealing with, guys that are like extremely technical, and like that's a focus, and it's very frontman focused, and there's a band backing that person up. And I also think of almost all those bands they're not bands per se. It's like they have sidemen that they pick up, and a lot of times people just put hotshot people on their records and stuff. That's not the aesthetic, I think, of like the Chicago music scene, and it's just not part of the Chicago sound. And I do think that there is kind of this earthy, blues oriented sound that comes out of Chicago, even when people aren't playing the blues per se.
Chicagoans are said to have a particular manner of speaking, and I have heard it during my frequent travels and visits to the city. So I would like to know how music would reflect that kind of speech.
That's a tough one. I've never really thought about before. I don't know if this speech or that aspect of the rhythm comes through, but I think again, because Chicago is a Midwestern city, but it's also a metropolis, it has these two contrasting things that go together with it, which it's It's busy, it's very frenetic, but it's still Midwestern. And so there is just a laziness to even the frenzy here that I don't think you get on the coast. Now, in terms of how is that reflected in the music, I never thought about this connection and stuff, but one of the things I was saying before is like there's kind of this Chicago sound, and things don't have the precision, and I really don't want to confuse that with sloppiness. And what I mean is like, there you can have people who play incredibly technically who are as wonderful at their instruments and as virtuosic as anywhere else, but there's something to the speed of things here. And I mean, the group that I play with, I mean, the guys are all absolutely fantastic and stuff, and I really pride myself on being at the upper end of the technique of my instrument and working on that. But the band has this organic quality to it, and there's probably a little bit of laziness and flexibility to the time that you wouldn't get from that sort of metronomic approach to things. So I think that probably, like you're saying, it shows up psychologically in the speech and the manner in which people carry themselves.
What's the coolest sound you've heard recently, and how would you be able to play it on your instrument?
That's boy, I don't know. I'd have to think about that one. I can't think of something outside of music related things that I've necessarily like. I get to see. I mean, one thing that Chicago has that's amazing is it has a very vibrant improvised music scene and an avant-garde classical scene. So I mean, we have one of the greatest symphony orchestras in the world. We've got the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and they're covering, of course, standard classical repertoire. But there are all these smaller ensembles, and there's more recently, I think, really within the past 5 to 10 years, been a bit of a fusion between some of the improvised jazz scene and the improvised classical scenes. And I think in those settings, you get to hear very surprising sounds. And from this, I mean, these are still instruments making the sounds, but I mean, people, and this has been going on for 50 or 60 years or more, but you get people just using their instrument in non-traditional ways and putting together unusual constellations of instruments. So those are the kind of things that I think are very fascinating, to me, that I've always really liked. I've always been extremely interested in orchestration. So, orchestration, if we define that as, I mean, if we just define music as organized sound, which I think that's a very beautiful and simple way to look at it. Because when two sounds happen randomly, while we can say it's musical, I don't know that we can say that it is music, because we couldn't replicate that or put it together. So we have to figure out what are the organizing principles for sound. And if we can replicate that or put that together, then we generally have music, organized sound. And then orchestration would just be the layering of those sounds together. And not to jump back to the trio, but I think one of the most interesting things about it, and one of the comments that we get the most when people are able to see the band live, we'll do something like take a Japanese movie score. We did one once for this film, Yojimbo, and this was a score from this composer, Masaru Sato. And it's written for a jazz big band, but it has a full Japanese orchestra, right? With all kinds of percussion instruments like that. Well, how in the heck is a jazz trio going to pull that off and replicate that sound? So we had to come up with really creative, unusual ways, like things that Michael can do on the drums, percussion-wise, to create that effect. Things that Dave can do on the guitar, just sound-wise, to try to fill that in. And then different techniques for string players, where you're playing on the strings, ponicello, hitting the bass with the stick, it's just different things. And it came off really, really well. that stuff I think comes through in the recordings, but when people see it live, they're like, I just can't believe how you guys are getting all these sounds. Because people say it so over and over again. You guys sound like 30 people sometimes. And that's one of the most beautiful things that I get to hear. And so this was sort of a long-winded way of talking about those things of sounds that I'm hearing that interest me and the way they go together. And I really constantly keep my ear to the ground, for new ways of putting things together, because I'm always interested in whether we're writing original music or whether we're adapting something else. We really try to democratically, represent the instruments of the group to create those sounds.
As a Chicagoan, Joe Policastro likes to take advantage of all the city has to offer in terms of culture and especially music. He loves to go to clubs and venues where he can see and listen to what other musicians are doing and get a first-hand experience of the vibe in his hometown.
What do you do to stay in the loop?
Boy, that I mean, one thing that you just said that really resonates with me is the idea of being a listener first. And this goes back to some of my earliest experiences as a young musician. I started, pushing my way into jazz clubs when I was 14 years old, when you weren't allowed to be there, but the club owners were very cool about that and letting you in and letting you sit in the corner. And most, older musicians were always very generous with their time and their energy. But I remember once when I was young, and this has happened several times, but the bass player that was playing, would come up and say, "Oh, so I guess you want to sit in," almost like they had to offer it. And I mean, if I've got not opposed to sitting in, but if I was enjoying what I was hearing, and I mean, I was like, no, I just came here to listen. And sometimes people's face would turn, they'd be shocked at that, And so I think the way that I try to stay engaged is exactly that. It's like, you just really can't stop listening. And there's somebody every minute of every day is doing something that's interesting.
What's your favorite hangout like?
There, the clubs are quite, or I should say the patterns of the clubs have changed quite a bit. So there's a lot of places that aren't open on the nights that they used to be open, or the formats have changed. I mean, some of my favorites remain my favorites. I've always, I had some of my best experiences and continue to have some of my best experiences at the Green Mill. I mean, that club is so wonderful. But even their format has changed. I mean, one of the things that was amazing about them is they used to have late night sets and music going till 4 a.m. and now they've reduced all that, and they just have the main shows kind of between 8 and 12. So that's something that's changed, but again, I still love the club. I mean, there's so many great places, the Whistler's always a fun, fantastic stop. Hungry Brain always has interesting things going on there. Andy's Jazz Club in more recent years has really become another favorite of mine. And that's always had a heavy sort of tourism side of things, but there's great things, going on there. I still try to get to see the Chicago Symphony Orchestra as much as I possibly can. So I sort of make that a regular part of my diet as well. I could list 50 different clubs and why I like different things about them.
So, Joe Policastro also likes to venture into classical music and movie soundtracks as part of what he calls his practice. He specifically mentions Ridley Scott's sci-fi movie Blade Runner and the corresponding musical score composed by Vangelis to me as a major milestone in his own journey as a musician. Eventually, our talk moves on to a reading performance by Joe Policastro of a Carl Sandburg poem that is about as short as it is poignant.
My name is Joe Policastro, and I'm going to read a poem from Carl Sandburg. Here's a thing my heart wishes the world had more of. I heard it in the air of one night when I listened to a mother singing softly to a child restless and angry in the darkness.
How do you feel about that?
Boy, you know, there are certain writers that I don't know, something they can just make you feel something from just the rhythm of words and just the way they look on a page. And that was what I was struck by, I think, first. And then secondly is just the picture, the portrait that's painted by it right off the bat.
Which music of yours would best fit this poem?
You know, there's a song of ours that was on our last record. Our last album focused more on our original music. Sometimes the albums kind of have a heavy focus of reinterpreting, you know, other material. But I wanted to highlight, you know, some of our original tunes. And I have this song that's called Plain Song. Plain as in simple. And it was a little play on like the old style of, you know, composition, like which was known as plain song. But I separated the two and to mean simple song. And it starts almost like a simple little, almost like a pop tune, but it sort of is anything but that. But actually, no matter how complicated the song gets, I think what hopefully came through, what the intention was just this sort of commitment to melody and simplicity and such. So I don't know, something about that just reminded, when you asked that question, that was the first thing that came to mind.
Finally, our conversation goes back to trivial topics, such as Joe Policastro's daily routine that he's going to resume shortly after our talk.
What's your favorite breakfast like?
You know, this has to do with my sort of Spartan life in the morning. I'm very, you know, I eat pretty cleanly throughout the day to get for my workouts and things. But you know, my breakfasts tend to be just like, you know, yogurt and some fruit, or just a couple of eggs or something. I keep it pretty simple. Those days of big Chicago brunches and things, you know, I used to go to like M. Henry all the time and have those like, you know, ridiculous kind of brunches. Those are past for me.
What are you up to now?
I'm gonna get right into all of my morning practice and such. Like I said, I kind of keep up a very regular routine, and really just I've found especially after the pandemic, I mean, it was just, I felt so, I would have thought for most people, or should say people without kids, you know, like the pandemic could have been the time where they're just shedding and practicing and perfecting things. In addition to just having everything fall apart, it was impossible for me to keep up any regularity or routine because my son was in kindergarten when, I'm sorry, he was in first grade when no, he was in kindergarten and he lost his entire first grade year. So he basically, you know, I was almost like homeschooling my kids during that time. And, you know, it was just mentally, there was so much fatigue. So I really didn't get until they actually went back to school last year. That was still like last August was the first time where I was like, okay, I'm carving out this time for myself. And I started organizing my time a way that I hadn't, I think, since I was probably, you know, 18, 19, 20 years old in school, you know, and since then, I'm sort of addicted to it now at this point. It's just, I feel so centered throughout the day, just in getting to everything. And it calms my mind, which I think, makes me a better improviser, a better person to be around, So
when you come home from a longer trip, what's the first routine you would like to go back to?
Honestly, it'll be right back to like what I'm saying. It'll be just like I'll get up at 6 a.m. the next day and stuff, have my breakfast, start getting things organized for the day, getting everyone off to where they need to be, and off to practicing, and then of course all the other business aspects that come with all of this too.
Eventually, we quickly go back to music as a topic when I ask Joe Policastro about musical suggestions to illustrate our conversation with and remember it by. And so the story goes on from there.
Which song of yours would best illustrate this conversation?
I don't know why I'm thinking about it. Just I've had such a wonderful time talking with you, and I like your project. I find to be so to just be so unique and also human. That's the thing I think that I'm getting from this as well. I hate to keep picking things from an older album, but I'm thinking about them more personally because they're original songs. That song that I mentioned before, Plain Song. There's also one that's called No Idea. It's on that record called Nothing Here Belongs as well. And that one, I remember it was a song I was really struggling with finishing and writing. And I heard this interview that was almost like an existential kind of interview where somebody was talking about how people panic when they have no idea of what to do, but that having that is actually freeing, that you should view it as like tabula rasa, like clean slate, like you have all options. It's not that you have no idea, you have everything before you. And that was such a refreshing look at when you don't know what to do something. And strangely, after I was like able to finish the thing and tie it all together, and I decided to call it No Idea from that sort of inspiration of that.
Postscript. Eventually, Joe Policastro and I move on to a project that consists of crossing over and build bridges between people anytime, anywhere in the world. As part of my conversations with people, I often have them ask questions, either specifically for someone I know I'm going to chat with in the near future, or broadly for anyone I might speak with, anytime, anywhere in the world. As a result, the first question for Joe Policastro comes from another Chicagoan, an artist by the name of Jim Barker. He makes tile art, and one of his projects consists of filling potholes in the streets of Chicago with beautiful and meaningful mosaics. He has a broad question reflecting some of his concerns about the future.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I probably my general question is I guess it's kind of maybe about leaving your mark. Like, that started part of my thought process. I got into ancient history and loved it and whatnot. And you really, what's driven home is you're only on this planet a very short amount of time. And so that's part of my motivation too, is I work as much as I can. I'm trying to get as much done as I can in my the time I have here. So maybe I think it would be something like about that. It's like, you know, you're all these folks are passionate about what they do. It's like, what do they ever think about what they're leaving behind, and how and that's not they want to be remembered, but how what they're doing is going to be looked at in the future. Kind of a vague question, but I mean that you know, how do you leave your mark? I mean, does that even play into your? Does that not even concern you? Or, you know, I'm curious about when you're gone, how have you moved the needle? Or, you know, do you ever think about that? And if so, how, what, and what would make you happy?
You know, I mean, my gut reaction to that is like, I don't know, will people see these things 100 years from now? And I think that is, I mean, that was true of any era, but now more than anything else, with just I mean, with how easy it is to create things and just how much stuff there is out there. It's like sorting through this. Can you imagine what 100 years from now is going to look like in terms of the archive of photos and artwork and music and writings and things? But I mean, you know, assuming that anyone or someone even were to come across it and were to look at it, I would hope that they would just notice the absolute sincerity with which it was created. And that to me is again, I think the most important aspect. I don't care whether somebody, you know, thinks it's the most technical or perfect, or words I don't like at all. I would just hope they'd be like, wow, that was really honest, very sincere.
The next question comes from a French artist by the name of Quinquis. She comes from Brittany, France, and part of her work consists of singing in Breton, the local Celtic language, which she combines with electronic music. Her real name is Emily Tiersen, and she is the wife of Jan Tiersen, a French musician and composer whose soundtrack of the French blockbuster movie Amélie became a hit in the 1990s. Her question is addressed to any musician I might speak with.
How do seasons affect your music?
Well, sadly, here in Chicago, we don't get 4 distinct seasons. We tend to go between 2, which is hot and cold. But I think fall is my absolute most favorite season. It's for a variety of reasons. My kids' birthdays are all in the fall. My birthday's in the fall. My wife's birthday was in the fall. I got married in the fall. And I don't know. I think there's something. I mean, it's gorgeous too. You know, with the leaves changing, and I think in the Midwest, especially in Chicago, for me, there's like a longing for fall, because most of the time we get this. You know, it's hot, 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 and then leaves fall off the trees, and then it's snowing, and there's that feeling of just missing it. But every year, I don't know, there's kind of a longing or a hope for it, or a spring that lasts a little bit longer too. And for whatever reason, I know that this is, I mean, we've had such a wonderful fall this year. So in terms of like how I think it affects the music is that I think that sense of sort of a longing or a yearning for something probably shows up. And then the other side of it is that hunkering down that has to happen, the indoor side of the Chicago life, which can go from October to nearly June sometimes, where it's just there's something to that. And I don't know what I would say directly, but I would say those two aspects are probably the most. And that hunkering down time, I think, is usually the time where people are creating more, writing more, or working on projects.
The last question for Joe Policastro is more of a comment and, as such, belongs to the category of broader questions or comments. It comes from Brian Fast Lizer, the founder of a music band by the name of Fun Loving Criminals that started out of New York and was quite popular in the 1990s. His question reflects a general concern which Joe Policastro can clearly identify with. And his answer to Brian Fast Lizer's question will inspire me to instantly come up with a follow-up question.
When are we all going to just put our differences aside and go back to how we used to be and all get along and, just try and get through the day? Because if we help each other, we can achieve so much more than if we just end up picking each other apart for our differences. It's not much a question, more of a comment, but yeah.
Boy, that is something I think about over and over and over and over again, because I think depending on the world that you grow up in, you're either exposed to a diverse amount of people with a wide range of viewpoints, or you're in a bubble. And I didn't grow up in a bubble at all. And if I didn't find a way to get along with people that didn't think like me, I wouldn't be able to speak to anyone around me. And that's also just something that I've never enjoyed from anybody. Echo chambers, or people trying to find people who just think exactly like they do. That doesn't mean that people around you can't recognize that they hold opinions that maybe misconstrued, maybe run contrary to your own life. But I also don't think that gives you the opportunity or the right to just disrespect them and everything that they stand for, or disregard them as people or humans, or anything. I don't know if there is a day or a time or a place that could happen, but I think it's going to be it's really that each and every single one of us is responsible for making sure that in our everyday lives that you continue to be out in public amongst people. That's something, this isolation that comes from the internet era and such is not healthy for anyone. And I think by participating in things that also go way beyond words or viewpoints and things. And by that, I don't mean things that aren't written down, but I mean, we were talking about poetry before. We were talking about, whether you're talking about an artist, like you mentioned, who's turning some destruction into something of beauty and finding creative solutions, or whether you're participating in music, anything communal. Find what's common. Stop worrying about what's different all the time.
How can you and your music save the world?
You know what? I want people to come together to share in an event, in a community space there. And it shouldn't be about anything else other than that. There's a universal message in I think in music. And I mean, that doesn't mean everyone's going to interpret that message the same way. But I think that that's the best thing, is when you can bring people together in a space, at a place, and a time to share in a moment.